I know things are delayed a little bit, but I want to be respectful of the conference's time, so I stay within those boundaries. I think I had 50 minutes, so I'm just going to go for 50 minutes, I guess. They can stop me if they want to. All right. Good. Well, hey, I'm Michael Campbell, and are you... Oh, okay. All right. You're good. You're good. Yeah, just putting you in the hot seat there. And I'm from the North American Division of Seventh-day Adventists, where I work in charge of the archive, statistics, and research. And have been there about 2 years, and have a background in higher education. We've served in cross-cultural context. My wife and I taught at IS, or seminary, in the Philippines for about 6 years. I make sure that at least I'm introducing myself as IS, Adventist International Institute of Advanced Studies. One time I was introduced as working for ISIS, very different organization. Yeah, having a lot of fun, and I'm glad to be here with you despite some travails of travel. But let's bow our heads together. I feel like it's just not a proper meeting if we don't start with prayer. Is that all right? Let's pray. Father God, just bless our time as we spend some time reflecting about our Adventist past, as we think about our beliefs and lifestyle and all of these kinds of things, that these are opportunities for us to learn from. So bless our time in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, delighted to be here with you. This is my first time here at this ABC conference. There we go. And I've heard a lot of good things about it, so I'm looking forward to being with you here the rest of today. I'm sorry I haven't been able to be here the whole time. But I want to begin by telling you that I think we're really in the age of a new era of Adventist historiography, studying the Adventist past. We have some great new resources coming up around the corner, and Oxford Handbook of Seventh-day Adventism. We've been working in that for the last 7 years. Nick Miller, who was just here, I know he has to take his students back to Maryland, and have had fun collaborating with him and about 40 other scholars, both inside Adventism, outside of Adventism. One of my big mantras, is to try to create Adventist scholarship that's understandable by people outside of Adventism. I think that's what a lot of happens with healthcare, right? Is we have this Adventist message of healing and wholeness, but how do we translate those values in a way that other people can understand? And so that's what we're trying to do in a very academic way. And then watch for just finished the manuscript last week with Ed Allen, longtime religion professor at Union College, and we just finished a textbook, a historical overview of Adventism, to introduce, again, people that are not familiar with our tradition. We're also designed it as a textbook so that those that are doing survey courses on Adventism, so it might be a resource for some of you, I hope. And Erdman's, we're under contract with Erdman's to have that come out. But what we're trying to do is create, and again, this is a new era of historiography, where we're able to go into greater depth than ever before. This is another exciting project that began about 5-6 years ago, the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventism, over, I think, 5,000 articles, entries that are now on there. And by the way, I need your help. A number of you that are in this room should be, or maybe you have already, and if you have, thank you, but contributing articles to the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventism. And we need entries on topics related to bioethics, okay? So come hit me up this afternoon if you're interested. It's an easy way to, it's not easy, but there is a peer review process, and I'm really, again, excited about that. We're also developing new resources, because part of what we're doing is looking, how do we not only create good scholarship, but how do we transmit that in a way that's accessible for people? And maybe you've had this problem. You write an academic journal article, you pour hundreds, maybe thousands of hours into getting this published and going through that whole process, and then you look at your downloads and only like 50 people have ever read it. And so how do we take excellent scholarship? And part of this, I was training pastors in northwestern China when you could still do that some years ago. And I preached, they invited me, they said it was safe to do so in that particular community. And Sabbath morning I gave a sermon, and afterwards this guy came up to me and said, "Oh, I love church history. I listen to Walter Wyeth every week." And if anyone's not familiar with that, it's a conspiracy theorist that's online that likes to talk about Jesuits in the church. And I have to tell you, this just broke my heart. Now, I tried to have a good poker face because I didn't want to, crush his spirits. But the question is how do we create good scholarship about our past and do it in a way that is understandable, that people can be able. And so we've got some great podcasts that a network, we're calling it the Adventist History Network. Our newest one to launch is my wife, who is just finishing, she'll be defending here this summer from Baylor with Philip Jenkins and Beth Allison Barr, a PhD in women's history. And I think she'll be the first Seventh-day Adventist woman to have a PhD in women's history. So she has a podcast called They Also Served, some really exciting things. And I'm going to give some introducents here to some overviews. They asked me to talk about Adventist history like in less than an hour. Like, what do you say, in less than an hour? So I'm going to give you some basic overviews of some things that I think are really exciting that are happening right now, and how, again, the field of Adventist history is changing. What are some of the major themes and topics that are really important that I see happening and changing? But I'm excited about that. Great resources. So for every article that I get maybe a couple hundred people to read, we get close to 1 million views on these podcasts as part of our network in each year, and every day those numbers are going up. And so that tells me that there's a lot of interest in the past. And then how do we take that in a way, again, that's usable, that takes good research scholarship and makes it accessible? So why does history matter? This is a famous statement from the American Historical Association. It's used often in historiography classes. 4 major reasons why the past matters. Number 1 is that we observe change over time. The past is never a static, tabula rasa kind of thing that we see. There is things that are happening. What the present isn't the past. We have to make sure we don't avoid this presentism, that we're constantly reading the present into the past. But we do see recurring patterns where we can learn from. There are echoes. And so we do see change happening. We want to observe what changes have happened, why those changes have happened, et cetera. And by the way, this is really interesting. If I have time at the end, I'll tell you, for example, this comes back to some of you with your topics here this week with this conference related to bioethics. For example, abortion. What's very interesting to me is, and I was going through the archives, Robert Pearson, our most conservative General Conference president in our Adventist history, I think even probably more so than our current leadership of the church, okay? And he was actually very, and I went through his archival papers at the General Conference, and he has statements that are very progressive about how abortion is, it's unfortunate, but it has to happen. We have to trust our medical institutions to make those decisions. And that's a far cry from a lot of the rhetoric I hear inside of Adventism and outside of Adventism going on. So it's very interesting. We see change happening over time, including on some of these bioethical topics and issues and what have you. We'll also have causality, what actually causes things. Certain things happen. Yesterday, we had the panel session on Kellogg, right? And so we see the impact that a certain string of decisions happened on the shape of Adventism on a variety of different levels. We also see complexity. I think there's a danger, especially in our society today, where we oversimplify things. We take very complex topics and issues. We try to make them black and white. And one of the things I think education does is it helps to problematize. And so this is what I love to do. I like to problematize things. It's a little bit more complicated than you might think on the surface. And then also contingency that, there's a variety of different outcomes and ways that things can continue to happen. And we continue to have agency because certain things are happening or not ill-fated, that we can serve in ways that can change the future in our own particular situations. I was listening to Prince Caspian on Sabbath. I went to one of my best friends' doctoral graduation, so did a 10-hour road trip with my son. So I said, what do you want to listen to? He had to suffer with me in this long road drive. So we listened to the whole Prince Caspian in one day. And there they are. They returned to Narnia. I'm sure you're familiar with the story, but they're trying to remember. They're trying to remember. And then finally, they have this aha moment where they realize where they were in a familiar place that they had been hundreds of years before. And this is what we try to do when we're talking about our past, is trying to remember, to make sense out of the past and the present. So how do you deal with this big picture of Adventism? So I just did this textbook on Adventism. This is our rubric of how we tried to break down our Adventist past into some categories. They're kind of messy. It's not a clean, exact science. By the way, when we did our textbook, we did a survey about 10 years ago that no one was using the previous textbook anymore, not one of our schools. So we discovered we need to create something more accessible. And so this is how we broke down our past, the formation of our church, the early days going back to the Millerites, to the organization of Adventism. 65 seems to be a good stage to close off, because that's the end of the Civil War. It's also the organization of the medical work with the Health Reform Institute. Then you have the development of Adventism from post-Civil War, the Reconstruction period, up through Ellen White's death and the heyday of fundamentalism. Some of you know I've written a couple of books, 1919, 1922, looking at Adventism and fundamentalism. I argue that fundamentalism really changed in a very significant way how our church, it changed Adventism in just the most profound of ways. In my 1922 book, I argue that it changed Adventism in terms of race and gender. And these are two themes I'll talk a little bit more about later, because I think they're very important. How we tell our past, the stories we choose to tell and how we tell them matter a great deal. They tell us a lot about who we are and about ourselves. And we have the building up of institutions towards maturity. We have the growth of a global church, and then contemporary challenges that we face. I heard there was a very scintillating presentation Peter gave this morning about some of those challenges. So I probably don't need to review you on those. You've heard some of them, but those are ongoing. And by the way, those are not just here in North America. We have those challenges all around the world. Having spent time traveling in over 100 different countries myself, I've gotten a little bit of a taste of that in different parts of the world. Another way of organizing the past is what we call the turning points methodology. It became very famous with Mark Knoll. Now it's been expanded into a whole series of books. Maybe you've seen those. Alicia Kaufman, my good friend at Baylor, just came out with an American version of that. And we're going to have a paper session in January at the American Society of Church History, where we're going to be discussing Alicia's new book. And I organized it actually into a series of turning points in Adventism. Now, this is my little area of controversy, because I actually wrote this as a Sabbath school lesson, and I've never been able to get it past the Sabbath school study, the committee. I can't get enough people to all agree on what the turning points are. So that's one of the things when you have a political process adhered to an academic process. So we'll see. Maybe someday it will come out. But those were my turning points that relate to. And I think it's important that we talk about healthcare. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here in just a few minutes. There's a number of different themes, and so I've had to be very selective. But I want to highlight healthcare. I want to highlight race and gender here on the little bit of time that I have. I put this slide in here because this is the famous 1833 falling of the stars. I think it's difficult for ourselves today to put ourselves in the shoes of people that were alive 200 years ago or 150 years ago. Life was so profoundly different. So talking about complexity, one of the things you try to do as a historian is you're trying to help people step into the shoes of people living in the past. What was that like to actually have lived through those experiences, and how did it profoundly shape and change their lives? You know, weather, meteorology, all of these things, comets that were going on, typhoons, and forest fires, all of those things that were, climate change was having a profound impact on the 19th century with the rise of modern industrialization. And this is part of a driving factor of, I tend to lean towards a more social approach to history, and we see that's impacting the apocalyptic, how people are wondering, how does that change things? And over time, we see patterns where when there are times of significant we see times of significant interest in the apocalyptic are times when there's great uncertainty and social change. And also with climate change, we see also that pattern taking place. So very interesting. I think that foretells a lot about what's happening in our current society today as we're looking at climate change and some of these kinds of things that would be helpful. Of course, William Miller, he dives into Scripture very quickly here. What I love, and I try to make this, as a theologian, but also, bridging the gap between theology and history, I love to keep coming back to our pioneers being so Christ-centered. I think sometimes we miss that in our telling of the past, and that's something that this is one of these descriptions of Miller's meetings, and he talks about how these lovers of Christ, and he talks about falling in love with Jesus, reading Scripture, opening Scripture, and just falling in love with Jesus. I think it's such a beautiful way to frame our Adventist past. And a lot of young people today, they don't know who William Miller is. They don't know who Ellen White is. We have the Value Genesis. In my role, I work with statisticians. We have a number of different, we have probably about 25 major research projects going on at any given time. And what we're seeing is that most young people today have no even name recognition of our pioneers, including Ellen White, to the point that it's almost statistically indiscernible in terms of having any recognition of Ellen White's name at all among Adventist young people. So that tells me we have a lot of work to do, but it's also an opportunity, because I think that we also come with kind of a blank slate almost, that we can give them a whole approach to the Adventist, our story, and introduce them to that. And of course, part of that story is also being on the margins of society, and we have a story from being at the margins to the mainstream. So how did we go from a movement on the margins that was kind of suspect to a move to a place where we now have Advent Health that is sponsoring the Daytona 500, and some of these things, which is quite remarkable. Some countries like Papua, where the majority of the population are actually Adventists. We actually have people that are heads of leading politicians and government positions in different parts of the world. I had a meeting with a congressional delegation and a group of we had a group of senators and Congress leaders that and the opening speech was our senator from Maine, Susan Collins, last Tuesday night, talking about Ellen White and how excited she is that she's from her state of Maine. It's quite remarkable. I'm not sure we would have expected that 100 years ago, but here we are, a movement moving from the margins to the mainstream. One of the themes I think that's really we're seeing a lot of work on in the last 10, 15 years is the activist roots of our pioneers. And I like this because John Starkweather, who is an early Millerite in Boston, he talks about, I had before been very confident that all religious experience and religious action which should result from the belief of this doctrine, that's the second advent of Christ, must be selfish in its character and therefore spurious. But I know that such an opinion on this subject, let who will entertain it, is both unscriptural and false. Well, what is he talking about? He's talking about the initial idea of the Adventist idea at its very core and beginning was people just assume, well, if you believe Jesus is coming and this earth is going to burn, you're not going to care about the things around you, the society around you. And the paradox is that Adventists were actually more involved in their society, more involved in social reforms than the average people around them. And so, for example, the Millerites were by far some of the most ardent abolitionists in the 19th century. And there's a great new dissertation that Kevin Burton just completed this last year from Florida State University that looks at that from the abolitionist angle. Pretty much all the Millerites were leading advocates of abolition. Did you know that? And not only were they that, but they were also leading advocates of health reform. Now, most of our health reform historiography has been framed around Ron Number's book, Prophetess of Health, which is very interesting because people want to know, where did Ellen White get her ideas? But they miss the whole idea of the Millerites being, there is a much stronger connection to this idea of wholeness in health And I found a whole series of Millerites that were medical doctors and health reformers and temperance and the whole 9 yards. And there's all these teachings so that when Ellen White comes out with this Adventist outlook, our pioneers, they already had a strong framework of abolition. They had a strong framework of health reform. So this should not come as a surprise that they go further down this path. And that, of course, is very interesting. I think it's interesting that Ellen White had visions and everything else, but there's a larger context that needs to... So Adventists were activists. By the way, 1/3 area, I've mentioned race now, is... and we're still finding more stuff on race. The Washington, New Hampshire church, our quintessential first Adventist church, that was a mixed race church, white, black, and Native American. We can now document that. Until this last year, that had never been documented before. So really, that's quite amazing, the egalitarian focus. And then the number of women that were involved and empowered in the early Adventist movement. Just last night, before I'm going to bed, I was reading The Midnight Cry, because that's what you do when you're an Adventist historian, when you're getting ready, you can't go to sleep, and we all have our problems, but so that's what I was doing. And I found 2 more Millerite women that were preachers that no one has ever written about before. And I'm just randomly reading through, just for fun. And and there's so much work that needs to be done on gender. Our pioneers were very progressive. Women were very involved in leadership and in proclaiming the Second Advent message. I have a few more slides here later, but here you get this idea. Here's a smidgen of the many reform societies that were going on in the 1840s to show you how activists our pioneers were. They were very involved in their society, their communities, making an impact, making a difference. And so I think this is important for us to study our past. People are like, well, what's going on today? Why are you doing that? And I said, well, that's actually, I care about issues related to race and gender today because our pioneers did. It's part of our Adventist ethos, part of our identity, and we need to care about these things today too. No one's ever written about this, but I just found this reading through some of these Millerite periodicals, outreach to some of the native peoples. And of course, they had some of their prophets and so on that were foretelling. And we haven't really, done any work on our early Adventist work to some of these indigenous peoples here that were along here before us. But there's some interesting intersect there that can be explored much more. We also see how missionary-minded they were. We know that the Millerite through literature went all the way to the Sandwich Islands. Today we call that Hawaii, and I had to make a research trip out to Hawaii because every good Adventist historian needs to go to Hawaii and do some research, right? So, you got to go where the archival materials are, and I actually went into the archives, so honest to goodness. And there was a big Millerite revival going on in the South Pacific. It's amazing. No one's ever written about this. And other parts of the world, as well as they were sharing literature. It shows you very early on that Adventism was a global movement. And again, that's where we're seeing a lot of work done on Adventist historiography, is the global aspects of Adventism. I'm going to just go on quickly. This is Joseph Bates talking about how literature had sparked a revival all the way in New Holland, which is Australia, what we refer to as Australia. Talking a little bit about lifestyle now. S.N. Haskell, Ellen White, she's very concerned that, Adventists don't get carried away about, becoming vegetarian and clean food. And so she admonishes S.N. Haskell, that famous statement. Of course, Adventism will pivot very quickly towards health reform. This is where, again, I think we've so focused on Ellen White's inspiration and sources because of our 20th century battles over inerrancy and infallibility that we've been obsessed about that and not really caught some of the 19th century nuance of the health reformers, James C. Jackson. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to go quickly here, but here's his reform water cure that was in Western New York, where James and Ellen White went to. You can actually go there. There's a museum, a local historical society. You can also do some food history, which I think would be a fun way to teach Adventist history nowadays. I use it when I do survey courses, have students recreate early Adventist recipes, kind of fun. And of course, they claim to have the world's oldest graham cracker on display. So some real great potential and opportunities, I think, in the future for doing more creative work in our Adventist past, how we approach it. Of course, here's Aaron Hilliard. It's at his home, his family, where Ellen White will have her far-reaching health reform vision. Most of you are familiar with that, with the 8 laws of health. What's interesting is, again, we focus so much on our Adventist context, we miss the wider context going on in society. Most health reformers were proclaiming the 8 laws of health to promote white Anglo-Saxon Protestant hegemony in America. So it's a very racist kind of sensibility. And what's interesting is Ellen White, she detaches those ideas from race. She never talks about white dominance and that kind of thing. And she takes some of the best from these health reformers and then applies them to an Adventist concept of wholeness and everything else. And this is very interesting. Yesterday we talked about Kellogg. Kellogg will kind of hold on to some residual aspects of that kind of racism in terms of his views of health reform, which maybe it's all the best that the church and he parted company. I'm glad we didn't go further down that path. Ellen White will write about this in her book, Health or How to Live. Again, from the very first time she writes about it, she's quoting all of these other health reformers. She's not trying to hide it. She's just trying to find a path forward. And what I think is most significant about Ellen White isn't the ideas of health reform, but the connection between the spiritual and the physical and the mental together in terms of a theology of health reform. That's what seems to me to be very unique and different from Ellen White, not the health reform ideas themselves. That's where sometimes we allow anachronistically our modern battles and problems today, we read them back into the past. One example of that is salt. Jackson saying, don't use salt. Ellen White's like, maybe there's a more moderate approach to using salt in dietary intakes, and we see that Ellen White had tended to be much more moderate. We've imposed upon Ellen White making her like a rule book. Have you noticed this? A rule book by which everyone has to code by which people live. Here's the Health Reform Institute, of course, that comes out of that, and Adventist health will become officially institutionalized. By the way, Kellogg, I think I mentioned this briefly yesterday, and it was just very quickly. Kellogg steals the limelight. It was women. We had 3 women physicians that were basically holding the Health Reform Institute together, and the leader of that group she tragically dies. Kellogg comes in, steals the show, promises to put a big portrait and life sketch of her in the new Battle Creek Sanitarium, never makes good on it. He always likes to talk about how he did all of these things and doesn't give any attribution to those female physicians who really were the glue that got it started until he came and finished medical school. Here's some of these early physicians, and of course, Phoebe Lampson, which I find especially very interesting, Kate Lindsay, and I found actually there's a third one. I didn't put her name or picture, but I'll have to do that. Of course, Kellogg's very interesting. It's all of the exercise equipment, all of the health foods, but for the sake of time, I want to come back to these issues of race and gender. The Millerites here are some of these examples of women. There's a periodical just for women, empowering women, liberating women during the midst of what's leading up to the women's rights movement of the 19th century. So very exciting. Until recently, we had done almost very little work on who these women preachers were. I've argued by 1910 there were over 1,000 women that were in positions of leadership as pastors, evangelists, working in very significant ways in the church. By 1930, there's basically none. We also go from a church that in the 19th century is largely abolitionist to by the time the 1920s, where we had denominational church leaders that were involved in the Ku Klux Klan. And that's probably the most controversial thing that I've ever written. And I've had people say, that makes me feel uncomfortable. Why do you have to write things that I don't like? And I said, well, I'm just a historian. I write what I find, whether it's good or bad or the otherwise. I write what I find, not what I want to find, okay? And so I had to write that, and it was very uncomfortable. It was unsettling, because it makes me, I celebrate the good things in our Adventist past, but then I also gives me an opportunity to address the areas where I find challenges. And I think that's what we have to do if we're going to be honest with how we approach the past. And so what we see is a reversal. And of course, I argue the reason that happened is bad theology. Fundamentalism really messed up Adventism. When we start getting into this rigid black and white hermeneutic of inerrancy and infallibility of inspired writings, it becomes very easy to insert some of these contemporary issues, which provide segues for conversations about what's happening in our world today, about nationalism and race and gender. These are recurring themes that I think are very valuable that we need to continue having conversations about, both at the church at large with public history, as well as in the classroom. So I hope that we can continue doing that. Here's one of these Millerite women. Again, no one's written her story before, but I love that I found a picture of her carrying a Bible, and just a really incredible. For the sake of time, here's Sarah Lindsay. This last, about 2 years ago, I found her photograph in the archives. Of course, thanks to AI, we can now colorize these things, right? And that helps us to bring the past to life a little bit. I think that's kind of neat that we now have a picture of our first woman in Seventh-day Adventist history to have a ministerial license. So that's kind of neat. So it's part of that recovery of the past. Some people call that revisionist history, but that's what we do. We look for the stories that matter, and we try to tell and recover those stories so that we can talk about them today. Well, I already mentioned this with the reversals that happen, but I think I'm out of time, so I have maybe just about 5 minutes or so, 5 or 10 minutes, I don't know, for a little bit of dialogue with you. I've covered a lot of history, so, but I hope maybe you're seeing some new resources that are out there and some new approaches to how we are talking about our Adventist past and Adventist healthcare issues and bioethics. I didn't have a lot of time to talk about that, but I did put in one more slide. Let me show you. There's a picture of Robert Pearson, just for fun, because you guys are bioethicists. I thought you would appreciate this. Here is Robert Pearson's notebook where he talks about abortion. So I'm going to let you linger on that, and I saw already a hand that was raised, and if you're curious, I'm happy to point you to some other resources. So,
for the sake of the audience,
and I'll go
you will use
one.
yeah.
Yep.
I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you for this great presentation. Where were you in 2015 at the General Conference session in San Antonio?
Yeah, well, I wasn't a delegate, so I didn't have any voice on the floor, but I was there. And my daughter had, the conversations we have have an impact. And we've always tried to be very careful to say very positive things about the church around our kids and things like that. But it's very interesting. My daughter had preached a number of sermons, was active in Pathfinders, and said, I want to be a pastor. She was talking about having very open conversations. After that vote that summer, we never had to, we're in a family that's very progressive and affirming of women in ministry and everything else. It was very interesting. She never talked about being a pastor ever again. And that's in a home that I would say, I hope, is fairly progressive and affirming of women in the church and otherwise. So, I think that's had a very adverse effect on a whole generation, and we don't know the full extent of that. But I've heard that story elsewhere. That's just how, as one father, observing in my own family. But I can also tell you of many other stories that go along with that, and I think that's really a tragedy. So I don't know what to say other than that. There's forces that are at work that are happening. So
you don't need to apologize. I was being facetious.
I'm not apologizing. I'm just saying.
No. What I'm saying
it's tragic.
What I'm saying is that it is tragic.
Yeah.
I'm talking about. I wish this information was shared in that context when we were having those arguments.
Yeah.
On the floor, and so I was actually affirming.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that.
And saying, I wish you were. Yeah. Your voice was there. That's what I meant to say by that.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
It came out a little facetious because my two sons were also watching that event, and they asked me about the social perspective of the church, of our church.
Yeah.
My question today is, how do you see, in light of this history, how do you see the church today responding to these realities?
I think change happens from the bottom up. And so what we're seeing, like in places like South America and Africa that have been very traditionally very conservative, some of my former students that teach there, I'm getting the increasing, that lay people want to see change happen. And as cultures change, as society changes, as birth rates decline. There's a great book by Philip Jenkins on faith and fertility. If any of you've seen it, it's a great book. Did he present? Yeah. I know he's presented a few times. At ASRS he presented too. But all of those are factors. And so those are those wider pulses that are happening around the world and world Christianity and society that will change and are changing the church. Yeah. Great, yeah. I don't know what to say.
Just to follow up on that, going back a few generations earlier, Randy Yonker is discovering that there's a significant number of ordained women priests in the early church and bishops.
I've heard some of that, yeah.
As late as the 10th century AD. So for 1,000 years, we had ordained women in the church.
Yeah. Beth Allison Barr has a really great book. Now it's a little shameless plug for my wife's doctoral advisor, but if you haven't seen it, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, and what she's doing is a survey of the untold stories and contributions of women all across church history, and this is, you start going back and your eyes are open, you're like, oh my goodness, how, I look at my own church history class from back in the 90s that my professor, I won't name his name, but there was not one story of a significant woman in church history. And how can we teach history when we're only telling half the story? Anyway, Stan.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Ellen White an ordained minister? Didn't she have a certificate of ordination?
Yeah, there's actually, I think there's 14 or 15 of those ordination certificates. And for those that are immersed into the nuance of Adventist debates on the topic, half of them are crossed out with the word ordained. So we don't know, did Ellen White cross that out? Did someone else cross that out? The other half have this ordination certificate. Now, what she said when someone asked her about it, she said that she was ordained at the hands of Jesus Christ himself. And I'll be honest, it seems a little bit like blasphemy to say that any human ordination service would supersede that of Jesus Christ himself. So I don't know how far we go. This is when we do polarizing theology by taking certain stands. I'm against things, and a hierarchical view of God, which is why we're having all these debates and controversies over Trinity and the strong pulse of anti-Trinitarianism. It's no accident that we have all these debates going on, and suddenly we have this big outbreak of anti-Trinitarianism around the world. And that goes back. The early pioneers, they weren't concerned about a hierarchical view of God. They were concerned about the word Trinity because of Catholic associations. And so now we have people going back to those debates anachronistically as justification for current, people. And it's like, well, you're appealing to the pioneers on the basis of tradition, which is very Catholic of you. So we have some Adventists that make very good Catholics.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Campbell. I really appreciate it. I wish we had more time.
Yeah.
I just have a simple question. Are there some names you could drop when it comes to like firebrand abolitionists from among the Adventists?
Oh, yeah. Where do I even begin? I mean, my friend's dissertation, I want to steal from him because he's in the midst of publishing it, right? Although, certainly he's one of my close friends, so so I've had the chance to get a little sneak preview. I've also found some abolitionists independent of him, but I know one of the stars of the show was Elon Galusha, and he was right involved in the midst of the heart of the abolitionist movement. Another one that I don't think is in his dissertation, I don't remember, but his name is David Plum. He was one of the leaders of the abolitionist movement in central New York. Also a Millerite, amazing. And so he writes just as much at least about the second advent of Christ as he does against the perils and evils of slavery. So we're talking hundreds and hundreds of pamphlets and literature and articles and meetings that we know that happened to show you how extensive the connections are. The Present Truth, which is the first Sabbatarian Adventist periodical. Now, I discovered this. So Kevin actually gives me a footnote of credit, which is very gracious of him. But I discovered this, and that was printed. We tell the story how that was published on a press, and James White stepped out in faith. Well, there were 4 presses in Middletown, Connecticut. He could have gone and had them printed. We're presuming the other 3 turned him down, most likely. The one that did print and let him take out in credit, $87.50. And there's the famous receipt in the White estate that's signed by Pelton, when he gets the money and steps out in faith. Then I went to the press. I said, I wonder what that guy was printing. And I discovered he was an abolitionist printer. So our very first Sabbatarian Adventist periodical, the very first, The Present Truth, our church was birthed on an abolitionist press. Isn't that incredible? But until a few years ago, no one had ever told that story, because no one ever bothered to look and say, oh, I wonder what Charles Pelton was printing, by the way, And that's where it's very important to look at context, because we're very good at telling our own story as if we are exceptional and we, didn't exist within a culture and the wider world, and we miss out on the significance of part of the story if we don't look at, okay, what was going on? Why did Charles Pelton? So Charles Pelton easily would have figured out James White was part of the abolitionist movement. So even if he didn't know him, it's kind of common cause. Well, I'll help you out because we both believe in the same thing together. We believe in the abolition of slavery. I'll give you a chance when no one else will. And that's how Adventism was birthed, Sabbatarian Adventism. Thank you. Yeah.
Just before that vote was taken, 2015, was it?
Yes.
Just
15.
before, like a month before, I was having dinner with my wife and the president of one of our largest unions in
Yes.
the NAD and his wife. And I asked the question, how are you going to vote?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, which is really, I don't know, my wife almost hit him.
Mm-hmm.
He said that he is for women's ordination, but he will vote against it to maintain church unity. And I said to myself, I didn't respond. My wife responded. I didn't have to say much. But it's interesting how we think sometimes.
Sure.
But, was he right? To maintain church unity, he voted against it, although it is against his own belief, according to what he said.
So let me tell you a story. I spent a significant amount of time overseas, outside of the North American division, so this is not a reflection on North America, and I won't say where this is because obviously I don't want to reflect in any negative way on the people that were there, but I was teaching a class one time, and I was the guest of honor of the mission leadership at a wedding. And so I thought, well, this is a great cultural experience, and usually there's always good food at weddings too, right? So I was really excited to be invited, and I get to sit at the table with the top leaders and everything. And we're sitting down at the reception at the wedding, and I was really enjoying my time there. And the mission president said to me, Professor, so glad you're here. I have one question for you. How do you make your wife obey you? And sometimes when someone asks you a question, you don't know how to respond. The best thing is you ask the question back, except I wish that I hadn't, because I said, well, how do you make your wife obey you? And he said, well, I have to beat her every week. And he looked at me in all sincerity and said, if you don't beat your wife, what do you do? And I said, well, we love them. It was this moment. And it was utter shock, and then suddenly I felt so painfully sad when I saw his wife later, and so we had a conversation out of that, right? And he said, and I said, well, explain, help me understand, because the best thing to do is to listen, right? So I'm trying to listen and understand where he's coming from. He said, well, the General Conference voted that men are supposed to tell women what to do. I said, well, I was at that same 2015 General Conference session. That's not how I remember the vote going, And I know that's not how my wife remembers that, even as disappointing as it was. And so, but this is part of the challenge of having a very diverse church where people in some cultures view women more as property than as actual human beings. And so when we have a diverse world church all around the world, I don't think we're ever going to see in the Middle East, at least not in my lifetime, women being ordained in the Middle East. Okay, so I do think there is a certain element of cultural context and where we need to be sure that we don't impose our culture in other places of the world. And I think it's not too much to ask other cultures not to impose themselves upon maybe a Western culture that sees women and sees all of these different issues in very different ways. So how that plays out is a very delicate balance of conversations in a very complex world church. And I don't profess to have all the answers to that, but in my heart, I'm still an educator, which is why I think we have a role both in the classroom and in public history, how we share in the stories we tell so we can educate people about our Adventist past. So, but that did open my eyes. Let me give you one other quick story. I was in, this one I'll actually say where I was. I was in Mongolia because I've spent a fair amount of time in China and Mongolia. And every student in my class was a woman. Amazing. Some of the best students I ever had. I mean, they listened to every word. I mean, just hung on every word. And from as early as I was willing to get up in the morning to late at night, they just soaked it up. And the top student, I was invited to speak at her church that Sabbath. And so her family, she came and picked me up. And I said, tell me your story. And she had been a petroleum executive, given up a career that paid very lucratively when she had converted for a church pastor's salary, which I think she said was somewhere around 10%, 15% of what she used to make. And she told me the pain of having some Western people, I'm not going to say who, but had come out to their country and visited and decried all the women who were pastors and said, we just need to find men to replace you, and you women just want to earn more money. You just want more money. She said, if I wanted more money, I wouldn't have given up my job in the petroleum industry. I'm here, and I never asked to be ordained. I just have the greatest privilege of my life, sharing Jesus with other people every day. And I thought, could there be any more amazing testimony of somebody who just loves Jesus and just seeing God bless her ministry, which is all ordination is just a recognition of what God is doing in and through that person anyway. So that's the greatest testimony of ordination, is just seeing the Holy Spirit work and the many people. She was the top soul winner in the mission, at least a number of years ago when I visited. And I wish you could have seen the tears in her eyes as she told me that story. That face haunts me. Yeah.
So, in chaplaincy,
Yes.
or chaplaincy is one of the refuge places that our female pastors find a place. In Advent Health, we have about 130 full-time chaplains. I would say about 35 to 40% of them are female.
Sure.
And I reaffirm what you just said about, the amazing ministry that happens, but we go through the pain every time there is a commissioning ordination service, to have to endure through that stuff. And I'll just leave it there. My question is, do you have these materials in a pamphlet form or something that could be used to give a perspective to all of us,
Yeah.
but also to affirm our colleagues, our female colleagues in ministry, because I'm always trying to find ways in which to do that. And this is amazing in terms of reassuring that, this is not just different today. Is there something like that?
There's a number of great resources coming up around the corner that I'm excited about. Now, you're talking about women, but we also need to talk about race and a whole bunch of other topics as well. But I think those are two that are paramount. We had a major conference on women in Adventist history last October. Really excited. We had about 45 or so presentations, and those are being edited into book form. Also, my spouse, Heidi, who's a trained women's historian. I mean, she has the formal training and the creds. And I thought, it's better to have someone who has the training and have a woman's voice telling women's history, right? And so that's what this podcast is. They also served. So the initial episode is already on there. So subscribe and tell other people about it, because she interviews a number of women who are scholars, historians, both in the church, outside of the church, that are helping to tell these stories. And we're trying to do more. My daughter and her two friends created a Women in Adventist History Pathfinder Honor. They're going to teach it at Camp this summer. I'm very excited about that. And so those are just some of the things that, some of the ways the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventism, my COVID project started, several years ago, but every Sabbath morning I like to write. So that's what I just do, because compunction, I can't help myself. And so what I started doing is writing stories. I found about 100 stories of women whose stories had never been written before, told before. So I wrote encyclopedia entries for them, and I think the editors were getting a little tired of me, because I kept writing back and saying, here's another one, can't believe it meets all the criteria. So we just need to keep doing more to keep writing history and do a better job at it. And by the way, we need to do it about race. We have a new book on race. We have a conference on race and Adventist history as one of our upcoming research conferences. We're working on a conference on environment. A number of these are important topics that for the church to remain relevant today, that we need to talk about these issues. We need to get our best minds in the church together, knock them together, and get that scholarship, and then find ways that it's usable, so that those ideas then can be transmitted into the classroom, into the pew, and training our pastors, et cetera. So there's more. I'm excited. The Oxford Handbook, we've got some great chapters on race and gender that are in the new Oxford Handbook. It's very nuanced, very, very well done. Well, I'm a little biased, but I mean, it went through, like, every article's been peer reviewed 15 times. It's like it's just crazy, right? And so, but I'm very proud of it. I hope that it's going to help tell our Adventist story and identity, so that people that are outside of our tradition can see in an honest way too, and say, not only tell that story, but admit some of the shortcomings and say, hey, here's the problematic aspects too. So, all right. Thanks for coming this afternoon. Yeah.